Hi, everyone. Welcome. I see some of our students and alumni, members of our professional chapter logging in. It's great to have everyone here. I know some people are still trickling in. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Molly Tobin. I'm the Director of Professional Programs here at the Alexander Hamilton Society. For those who might be joining us for the first time, the Alexander Hamilton Society, or AHS as we're known, is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy and national security space, imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We operate on college campuses across the country, and we now have over 1,600 alumni, many of whom are working in the foreign policy and national security space. If you're interested in learning more about what we do and to get involved, please visit our website, alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, and we'd love to connect with you. Today, it's my pleasure, as part of our America's Role in the World book series, to welcome Will Dobson and Chris Walker. Will is the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy. Prior to assuming this position, he was the chief international editor at NPR, where he led the network's award-winning international coverage and oversaw a team of editors and correspondents in 17 overseas bureaus and Washington, D.C. He is the author of The Dictator's Learning Curve: Inside the Global Battle for Democracy, which examines the struggle between authoritarian regimes and the people who challenge them. It was selected as one of the best books of 2012 by Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, The Telegraph, and Prospect, and it's been translated into many languages, including Chinese, German, Japanese, and Portuguese. He's also published widely on international relations, democracy, and authoritarianism, and his articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Policy, The New Republic, Newsweek, and elsewhere. He's also provided commentary and analysis on international politics for NPR, ABC, CNN, CBS, and MSNBC. And Chris Walker is Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy, NET, a private nonprofit foundation dedicated to the growth and strengthening of democratic institutions around the world. In this capacity, he oversees the department responsible for NED's multifaceted analytical work. He has a particular focus on authoritarian regimes, and he has been at the forefront of the discussion of how authoritarian powers exert influence on open systems, including in the context of sharp power. His articles have also appeared in numerous publications, including Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the Journal of Democracy. He is also the co-editor of Authoritarianism Goes Global: The Challenge to Democracy, in addition, of course, to being co-editor of the book we're here today to talk about defending democracy in an age of sharp power, which obviously I'll give you your placement right here. So Will and Chris, thank you both for joining us today. I'm hoping we can just sort of start with you both sharing how this volume came to be and why this was the right moment for you both to put it out.
Sure. Well, first of all, just thank you very much for having us. It's a great pleasure to be able to take time out of our days collectively so that we can tell you a little bit about the book, and more importantly, hear your questions and have conversation afterwards about that. On the book, I mean, this, there's probably a number of things, that kind of came together to make this possible, that made this sort of make sense for us. For starters, my colleagues here at the International Forum of the National Endowment for Democracy, I mean, they've really been leading the way, Chris in particular, in terms of really pushing and thinking really hard about sharp power, what it means as a broad, like as a lens, as a tool for us to think about a range of activities that are now threatening democracies around the world. And so they've been producing a lot of really forward-looking and serious work on this for quite some time. And then separately, at the same time, at the Journal of Democracy, we too are constantly in dialogue with authors. And so there was, just on its face, a certain amount of natural overlap, enough so that there was a critical mass of work that made sense to pull together. And so there were a number of there's some of the chapters in this volume have as their origin work that was first developed at the forum, and then some were organic pieces that came through the mill of the Journal of Democracy. And so what we basically saw is that in that we really had a substantial body that we could pull together the best of and sort of offer as a unique work in an edited volume. And so what we were trying to do is capture that thinking and do so in a way that shows a range and a real diversity of the ways in which both this phenomenon manifests itself in the world and ways in which it is possible to try to combat it. So that was sort of the I'd say the intellectual sort of inspiration for saying, there's a book in this.
Anything you'd like to add there, Chris, or?
Well, I think, Will, first of all, I have to acknowledge the Journal of Democracy staff because they produced this wonderful volume while they were still generating their normal flow of quarterly journal editions and a whole host of new content that people can find online, which I would really commend the audience to. And so it was quite an accomplishment. And in the larger picture, I think as we heard from more partners that Ned works with, even in recent years, it became clear that the sort of effects that engagement from authoritarian powers like China and Russia and others were having through media engagement or cultural engagement or through the knowledge sector, the education sphere and so forth, wasn't quite the way many people have assumed it would be in terms of being benign and softer. And because we started picking up more and more signals and more instances where the engagement had other characteristics, more in tune with censorship or monopolization of ideas, or exploiting partners in relationships, institutional relationships, we said, this really requires a little more scrutiny and focus, and maybe to take a fresh way of thinking about some of these challenges.
Right. I have a slew of questions, but before I jump in, I want to give you both, if you'd like, or if there's something you want to share to sort of set the stage before we sort of delve into some more specific questions. Or we can just go right for it.
I think we go right for it.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the book really is split into two key parts. The first really describes the manifestations and dangers of sharp power. And the second really discusses how democracies can fight back and defend themselves. And so given the centrality of sharp power throughout, can you delve a bit into just explaining to folks what sharp power is and how that contrast differs from soft power?
So maybe just building off my last observation, I think one of the key issues that has arisen is the assumptions that we had about how first globalization would play out. I think the assumption coming out of the Cold War was that these large authoritarian powers were, cloistered and maybe autarkic and wouldn't really engage with the world. And in many respects, they didn't up until 1991, at least not in the way we would imagine it to be meaningful. And that was the logic, through the 90s, but it hasn't really borne out. In a sense, Russia and China, their leadership took a decision to engage with the world and leverage globalization. I think in many ways that free societies didn't anticipate. And so the very instruments that they were using in the areas that Ned is most interested in the spheres of education and the civil society realm and media, turned out to be a bit different than people imagined. But at the same time, the framing coming from analysts and observers in free societies and how people think about, what success would look like. I think part of the wrinkle was that so many observers in free societies imagine that the autocracies would view success in the same way that democracies would view it, and that the engagement in the media sphere would be done to have more voices in the discussion, to have more pluralistic discussions. But when you peel away the onion and really look at the way our authors did in the book, for example, Sarah Cook's chapter on China, you realize that the state-driven approach to media and information, say coming from Beijing, is not quite the way you would imagine, or it would have been imagined, say, from the perspective of 1995. And that, I think, is a critical point, because it may well be that the leadership in Beijing and Moscow and Tehran views success and what they want to achieve with these instruments, these media and educational and policy instruments in ways that are actually quite different than our assumptions. We can talk more about that a little bit later.
One of the sort of connecting threads between all of the essays is that much of the problem is obviously insufficient awareness or literacy about sharp power in both government and civil society. Did the process of editing this book change your level of optimism or your opinions on what the calls to action should be?
That's a good question, because it really sort of asks us to check our assumptions at the outset. I do think, I don't know if I don't know if Chris and I would, I don't know if Chris would co-sign what I'm about to say. I'm generally pretty optimistic, and Chris is usually a level setter. And so I will say that, so I probably have that inclination anyway, but I think that when we think about sort of the cases where sharp power is sort of rebutted or stymied, at least, to make note, because I don't want to oversell it. I mean, it's not as though even in those cases where we are pointing to successes, it's as if, like, seeing the battle is won. By no means. This is ongoing, but I do think I became more optimistic because one thing you can learn right away is that it has very little to do with the size of the state. In fact, it's been rather small states that have been most effective at pushing back against what is a really large and powerful force. Particularly when the effort is emanating from Beijing. And so, in that sense, it's encouraging to know that Baltic states or Taiwan or the Czech Republic or Australia, which has its own complications, that they've been very effective in their own way at confronting this. And in many ways, what they share in common is that they're frontline states. I mean, they really are, particularly in the case of Taiwan, they really are a focus of a great deal of this activity. So maybe it's by dint of necessity. At the same time, there are a lot of things that you sort of begin to note that are a problem, and that this can be particularly true of some of the very same states if they don't have this capacity in place, and that is expertise. There is just a body of expertise that is required, particularly among sinologists, in order to just have the capacity to identify the threats, understand them, let alone be able to then try to take steps or measures to rebut it. But in most cases, what are those things? And when we look back at what they are, it's a lot of the things that made them liberal democracies in the first place. It's the work of journalists and media entities that shine a spotlight on what is going on, that sort of make clear to a public that maybe in this instance your institutions are failing you because of the way that certain elites have been effectively targeted or compromised through corrupt dealings, for example. That's a pattern that can emerge. And so I do think it's humbling on some level, because you realize just how widespread, and there's almost hardly a day that goes by where we can't see in the headlines more instances of this afoot. So in that sense, you have to be realistic. But I do think I came away from it more optimistic about the recipe that can be in place that can help at least make this harder for authoritarians to achieve.
And even if I have a slightly more negative or pessimistic view, I largely agree with Will. I think we're actually in a much better place today than we were even 5 years ago, because the mobilization of local civil society in a number of critical settings, the recognition by governments that this requires attention, and media engaging on these issues more directly, I think has changed things dramatically. But at the same time, the book points out that there really are, I think, a handful of countries that have meaningfully addressed this through the channels that Will alluded to, having civil society with expertise that are empowered, aware, having media that's willing to take that information from civil society, share it with the wider public, and then in turn having more societal response, often through policy reforms. I think the cases Will alluded to are the most relevant. And sometimes, it's a little bit tricky because to the extent one agrees with the sharp power thesis and that the monopolization of ideas, the sidelining of alternative narratives, and the exploitation of partners is what's coming from much of the authoritarian engagement, it itself can have the effect of slowing down or neutering responses. And I think you see that in a number of parts in the world, with China's case, where China will control effectively the media landscape about what is communicated and reported on China, at least on issues of strategic relevance to Beijing. And if you can't have a candid, balanced discussion about these challenges, you're already operating at a very significant disadvantage.
So I guess pulling on that thread of both China and sort of media, I mean, I guess unsurprisingly, there's a lot about China in this book. The book sort of focused on China. But what do you sort of see, I guess looking at media literacy, and we can use this recent TikTok legislation as an example. I mean, does that represent a significant positive momentum towards countering China in this regard with sharp power? I mean, how do you see the next steps post that? Is this a good representation of that?
So I think an example like TikTok is quite illustrative because in a sense you have an entity that's gained wide popularity that unambiguously has enormous influence, including in the information and ideas domain, and at the same time whose parent company is obliged in the end to be responsive to the paramount political powers in a globally ambitious dictatorship, in this case, the PRC. That's a pretty bad set of ingredients. And so all societies, open societies that are grappling with this, face these challenges of the balance between open communication, free expression. I would argue that this is part of our larger challenge in an environment that's globalized with this intertwining of democratic and autocratic countries and their institutions in the way that the book gets into. And this is a thorny sort of thing. I think US democratic debate is getting us to a place where we can have an informed discussion on it and try to settle on things in a way that's democratically accountable, which in the end is the most critical point. I would say, just broadening this a little bit, I think the challenge from China in the media and information space far transcends TikTok. The extent to which Chinese state media or Chinese investment in local media has proliferated over the last decade and a half in settings around the world has been profound. And I don't think we've really come to grapple with the larger implications of the CCP's ability to curate information, to limit what gets on, to privilege what gets more priority. It's a very significant thing in these settings, especially when local media may not be equipped to meaningfully and consistently scrutinize China's engagement on the ground.
Yeah,
So
I'm sorry. I mean, I completely agree with everything Chris just said. I think that in the book there's a chapter specifically not looking at TikTok, but looking at Hollywood and the entertainment industry. That author, Ein Kokis, has also written for the Journal specifically on TikTok. So that's a piece you can find on our site. But what is so novel here with the TikTok example is that I do think it's a precursor of things to come. I mean, what is really most, I think, significant about this is here was something that's actually created by an entity with ties to Beijing that is globally appealing. Like that just hasn't been the case. I mean, China has made many products, digital products, that are very appealing within the Chinese economic market, no doubt. And maybe some people have bought things on Alibaba or whatnot. I mean, these are very successful global, brands. But TikTok is really sort of a first in that way. It won't be the last. I think that's an important piece of it. But I and it's what Chris was sort of alluding to here, I'm as concerned about at a more sort of old school media level, that which we don't know in terms of, content sharing agreements that get revealed eventually, where you have media in a lot of other countries that are just drawing off of Chinese state media to fill their airtime, to fill their pages, and their readers, their listeners have no idea. There's a prominent example not too long ago of, and this is, I just put this in the success category a moment ago, of a Czech radio station that was broadcasting talking points created by the Chinese state media and produced, what were they producing? They were producing innocuous, non-political content, it would appear, but they were within those 30-minute episodes working in Beijing talking points, which is actually, it's a level of sophistication that's much greater than saying, here's what the party thinks about X or Y. It was much more subtle, but it went on for more than 1,000 episodes before the Czech listening public even found out that this agreement had been inked with a station that they had a pre-existing relationship with. So, that's just one of many, many examples of this. And this is happening, in a rampant way across Africa, for example. And so that, at least with TikTok, you have that, you have that knowledge of. I think it's very hard now for people not to know the origin story of TikTok, or at least understand, yes, I get that it has this tie. Maybe I don't care and I want the content, fine. But what we don't know, I think, is quite pervasive and also concerning.
So I want to sort of pull on threads that you've both said, but I also just want to let everybody, the audience, know they should feel free at any point. They can drop some questions into the chat, and we'll get to them towards the end. Obviously, you've both just brought up key points of sort of media, the free press. It has an important context in the book. Packaged stories from abroad being placed in local papers, certainly an example of foreign interference in democracy. What needs to change in journalistic standards and policies to combat that? And how can civil society really increase public demand for those changes?
So I can take a crack to start. There's a terrific chapter in the book authored by Edward Lucas that looked at essentially autocratic powers and autocratic behaviors that are insinuating themselves into our modern media system. And there are a wide range of reasons this is occurring. Some of this has to do with long-term trends where the sustainability of independent media in open societies has become far more difficult over the last 3+ decades. And that happened concurrently with the explosion of digital media, which has its own logic in the way it works, which sometimes can even further accelerate the pressure and undercutting of, I would say, more gatekeeper-like accountable media. And so that's been a long-term phenomenon. And then concurrent with that has been a decision taken by leaders in Beijing and Moscow, the Gulf states, to invest heavily in this space. So Will alluded to, the things you can see as state media on the one hand. So for example, news service that comes out of the PRC will be made in a subsidized way available to countries whose media, or settings where media is really under duress, and it can be an attractive economic option there. Whereas wire services coming from democracies may require significant payments, making them less desirable relatively. So there are those bigger market issues that I think we have to reckon with in the new environment, where there's this fierce competition in the media domain. At the same time, I think there's still a significant need for more awareness of how these media and information systems work coming out of the autocracies. And so that would mean more purposeful training and education, say, for key gatekeepers or elites who work on related issues to better understand these things. It might even mean editors at established media who could learn more about the way the CCP works. That would then, at least at some level, help accelerate key learning among people who are decision makers and sharing news and information with wider audiences. But I think it speaks to fundamentally the need to empower local societies and their civil societies to be better informed and prepared to grapple with these new challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the civil society element is very important, because it, in this context can vary a great deal depending on whether we're talking about here in the United States or Europe, or whether or not we're talking in Southeast Asia, where Chinese influence is much more present. I mean, what you require here, because to be realistic, in many instances, this is not going to come from a listening public or reading public. It's going to come from civil society, maybe with a focus on media or media literacy, becoming aware first of the fact that something seems amiss, or that content has shifted, or picking up on it. It may literally require that, and then broadcasting that and understanding the threat, why that isn't value neutral, why the fact that because it doesn't sound like overt political advertising, it still nevertheless is crossing lines that are recognized, and then broadcasting that both to the public, but also to the powers that be there, and depending on where we're talking about, that could be received more or less well. In the great moment here that many of these authoritarians have taken advantage of, frankly, is just the economic duress that media, particularly small local media, has experienced. And this is, we know this very well in the United States, but this is not just a US phenomenon. And so the commercial pressures on the media are such that it's made them vulnerable to needing or wanting to make these content sharing agreements, because it's a way to, one, get more content at a cheap price, and maybe even comes with further sort of commercial enticements that when they're thinking about whether or not they're going to still be in business several years from now, this answers a call that they have. And so that then becomes a much bigger question about investing in our own media and having viable going concerns that can provide a democratic public with the free information that it really requires. So it's a multifaceted problem. What we're really doing is highlighting the implications of this vulnerability, and that it can be exploited. And you can take this conversation that we're having right now about the media, and then you can begin to you can have the same conversation about universities. You can have the same conversation about think tanks or policy institutes, and so on and so forth. So all of these, I mean, at the end of the day, sort of the premise here is very much that it is the openness of these societies that is their strength, but it's that very openness that these regimes are taking advantage of and weaponizing to then try to actually undermine the premise of these societies in the first place. So it's a challenging problem.
Oh, I want to flip back for a minute to sort of what came out from your comment, Will, about TikTok, which is that it certainly wouldn't be the last, technology to be successful. And so, I mean, how can government and civil society better frame the discussion around sort of emerging technologies that do have good potential, but are also invasive when they get into the wrong hands?
So I think this is one of these modern challenges, and Will is absolutely right. It's only going to become trickier because, on the one hand, what is often the convenience and the presumed efficiency and sometimes entertainment, but also security value of technologies can have flip sides when they're adopted. And I think we're seeing this now at scale for many of the technologies that are originating from authoritarian settings, not least the PRC. I think the critical issue fundamentally, setting aside any specific instance, is to really accelerate the local understanding of the risks and rewards. I think what we're seeing in many instances is the ostensible rewards being put forward, often under the rubric of convenience or efficiency or security, or possibly entertainment, something like this, without having a full picture of where the downsides might be. And of course, there are always going to be these assessments in relationships. And as Will alluded to, the book actually goes through pretty systematically the entertainment sector. In Koka's chapter, Samantha Hoffman writes about these issues in the tech context, and culture. And Glenn Tifford has a wonderful chapter on the knowledge sector, broadly understood, largely focused on universities who are open and look to have partnerships. But in all these cases, finding the right balance is there. I think in the tech domain, sooner rather than later, free societies will need to really deepen while accelerating societal knowledge on these things to be able to say, okay, we're comfortable with this aspect of the new tech, whatever form it's coming, but there's some things that we're simply not going to embrace, not least because they may have very significant national security implications.
Do you think there's sort of an avenue where the US leverages partnerships with medium powers or even developing countries who may be at varying levels of democracy to discourage sort of dangerous CCP tech imports and exports? Specifically like smart city, some of the surveillance technology? I mean, how does that fit in?
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is a role for just making people, I think going back to what Chris just said, making people aware of the trade-offs and the downstream effects that this will have, the compromises. I think it's very difficult. I mean, I don't, I think that the next piece and from that awareness and understanding those trade-offs and that education can be twofold. I mean, on one hand, it can lead to greater regulation. And because at the end of the day, that may be ultimately what's required, but at least that is informed with sort of a broader conversation and understanding of what the threats are and why the regulation can be necessary. But in some instances, that's a very long-term process, and this is happening right now. And so, and I think it's important. It's growing much more sophisticated, and so we see. I mean, just this past weekend, I had an opportunity to meet with one activist from Brazil. So, working in a democratic context, okay, and he was very much concerned about the direction his country was going a few years ago under Bolsonaro, and they saw in which the way their media was, being corrupted and being turned into a tool to sort of really broadcast an anti-democratic message. And their response to this wasn't to wait for regulation, but to basically capitalize on it by making their own such tools where they were in a very like TikTok-like fashion, were producing a lot of content that frankly was totally politically neutral, totally innocuous, but targeting what they saw as sort of a persuadable public with things that would also heighten awareness of what Bolsonaro meant. And so if they did that too much, then they had no audience whatsoever. But if they did it more subtly, then they were able to sort of get in front of a public and have them at least ask questions about, wait, is this the best thing or not? So we see that actually it's happening on both sides. And so in some instances, you might see civil society spring forward and say, we're not going to wait for this conversation. It's taking too long. This danger is here now. That will not happen in many contexts. It can happen. It happened in this one, and they were able to build a very large audience. In others, in Taiwan now, there is much more concern about the growing sophistication of the PRC threat, which in the past has been very sort of heavy-handed and down to the level of really trying to privilege certain politicians and focusing on some parties over others to try to tip the outcome of elections, to saying, okay, well, maybe that doesn't work as well. Let's try to change the younger generation's view of Taiwan or mainland China. And so these are all happening in real time. And so I think we're going to, at the end of the day, in a democratic context, this has to happen in multiple ways. And there's a role for civil society, and there is a role for government too. But I think we know that the governmental response often takes a little bit more.
And I would just note, Molly, that our colleagues here at the International Forum produced a report not long ago. I believe it was titled "Smart Cities and Democratic Vulnerability," that really zeroed in on this extraordinary tension with several case studies in open societies that had young democracies. And it really is, it's a very significant challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it is too, because it sort of spotlights for you how these technologies can be very appealing to a government, but often are not as appealing to the public in the same country. And so it really becomes a question of what type of government are we talking about? Is this a government that is looking to import this technology because it is not on a democratic trajectory, or is no longer a democracy? Or is this a contested democratic space where if the public was more aware of the fact that their elites or their officials were about to usher in this new wave of surveillance, that they still have the political opportunity and leverage to try to put a stop to it, then that becomes a place where the role of civil society, can be job one.
So let me ask you one final question from me, and then there's already been some questions that have come in if folks have some others to put them in before we conclude. But I'm sure this is the case anytime you write a book or put a book out, which is that the minute it goes out, there's always things you see that could be added. But it's fair to say there's been a lot that's gone on in the world in the last 6 months. Are there things that you would have put in the book that weren't included, that have gone on, or that you think are relevant, that weren't incorporated since it came out?
I mean, I think the answer to that is so much. No, that's absolutely true. No, I mean, I think that if, for example, and in fact, because at least at the journal, we have the opportunity to continue to keep working all along, even as we, produce a volume such as this. I mean, I would have loved to have carved out space to spend more time focusing on the threat from Gulf states. We've seen a lot from Saudi Arabia. We've seen a lot from some countries that don't get as much attention, but are no less deliberate and intentional in their sharp power efforts, like the United Arab Emirates. And so, in large part because of that, the journal recently published an essay by someone named Christopher Davidson, looking very specifically at the sharp power threat from Gulf states. And so, if we put out another volume, I'm sure that we're going to shoehorn that in as a chapter, because it merits that and much more. But.
And I think Will hit the nail on the head. There's barely a week that goes by without some other revelation of, and this I would say is part of the glass half full interpretation of what's going on. Really good reporting, for example, on networks of Chinese media holdings in Africa, or the story from the Czech Republic that Will alluded to. Even if it was operational for quite some period of time, society was able to learn about it and then take appropriate action where it's operating outside of bounds of democratic norms. Cuba is one of these countries that is, I would contend, capable of exerting meaningful influence beyond its borders as a dictatorship. And a number of our colleagues are doing very interesting work on how the Cuban regime is shaping the ideas realm in ways that may be underappreciated. And I think there too, it's a pretty good example, in addition to the Gulf, which Will mentioned, of this subset of countries that either have regional or, in a number of cases now, global capacity to exert influence. And I think we've underestimated Russia's resilience in this regard, because, just as an example, Russia's engagement in the Spanish language space is also getting more and more scrutiny. Really good investigative reporting and civil society work unearthing the ways in which Russian state media or its proxies are operating in the Spanish language space. That's almost a monthly thing now, and so I think there's a lot of fodder for more engagement on this, but it's also a testament to the momentum and the scope of the challenge and all.
I mean, the good news here is that at least there's a developing vocabulary for this. I mean, I think again, if we go back even a few years ago, that wasn't the case, and that's why I think that while ultimately what you really require is much more public awareness, if that's going to happen, I have a journalistic background, so I'm maybe biased this way, but I really think it's really important that journalists and members of the media know to identify this, that when they see these sort of stories or fact patterns emerging, that it fits into a broader pattern or category for them of, I've seen this before and these things are like others, and then that will go a long way to making the public then follow on and say, oh, this is like that other case that I saw out of Belgium, or this case that I saw reported in Australia or here or there, and then you begin to sort of stitch these things together. It's like a lot of things, like once you sort of you know see something and you notice it, then you see it everywhere. And I think that's if some element of that can come out of this book and the work that Chris's team does and the journal's producing, then that's a large part of the mission.
Well, in the time we have left, let me transition over to some questions that folks have sent in. So the first is if you can sort of comment on how NED's work, or really NGOs at large, has changed or could change to incorporate defense about sharp power.
So I think the wider community, including NED, has mobilized pretty significantly to address these very democracy hostile forms of authoritarian influence that have taken shape. And as Will notes, as the terrific research and unearthing has progressed, and it really has, often through the work of terrific NED partners, the ability of those societies to develop informed responses has grown. And so that's really good news. And one of the cases we allude to in the book in the Czech Republic, which has, I would say, a disproportionate amount of expertise on China. And so in the civil society community, there are at least a couple of groups that are really first rate, that have played an incredibly important role in packaging, explaining in easy terms for the public the very complicated methodologies that, say, the United Front Work Department might rely on to advance its ambitions in such settings. And the media in the Czech Republic is quite attuned to this, often relying on information that's being produced coming from these civil society groups. And so that's a pretty good template to look at. And I would argue, in turn, policymakers and officials who have a wide range of concerns and their agenda is always very expansive can actually zero in and say, hey, these issues we're learning about from China's engagement here, these cross the line and therefore they're no longer welcome and we're going to take appropriate action, or figure that certain forms of engagement are okay, which is part of this challenge, and proceed accordingly. But I think it's in those settings where you're really able to get the right mix of civil society, media mobilized early, where you get the best outcomes.
Next question we have is, authoritarians are able to exercise control over nominally private firms in ways that Americans have difficulty imagining in comparison. How should the US government approach these illicit uses of private companies, and how should it be discussed with the American people?
I think the premise of the question is right, and I think it is very hard if you haven't. I've spent a lot of time in China, and if you haven't, in years past, I visited many of the firms that have morphed. That TikTok didn't exist at the time, but they have morphed into things that are, they're very familiar to an American audience or American customers, in terms of, like the Alibabas, the world, or the WeChats, and frankly, we're ahead of the curve in monetizing these sort of lines of innovation, really, at a pace that was very much on track with the U.S. And more ambitious in that it was looking to go global even quicker than some U.S. companies. And so, and if you understand that and the political system in China, you understand how these things they move together completely in lockstep, and that's just not something that it's such a foreign notion to I think Americans in particular that it's hard for people to appreciate that, and so there I think it becomes really important. I'd say two things. One, I think it's a really important. The question was, what can the U.S. government do? I think that frankly, I think that while the role is to educate and is to make people more aware, and I think this is something where it's really important for our public officials to sort of share this perspective. I think I'm more, maybe this is where I'm less optimistic, where I think it can't just, I don't think it should just come from the U.S. government. I think that people need to hear this from civil society groups. I think people need to see this in the material that is presented in classrooms, in university settings. I think this is something that shouldn't be a foreign notion or to people in universities that are teaching this material, and that's another reason why we produce a volume such as this. I mean, this is something that we see as being readily available and quite useful for the classroom. A tremendous number of the Journal of Democracy's essays are required reading on syllabuses at universities, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. And so, we see that we take it very seriously as part of our work, is just to share this perspective. And I think when people become more aware, then it's possible for us to get to the next issue, which is what those trade-offs are. But I wouldn't limit it to being something that is a U.S. government role. People need to hear it from other sources, and they need to hear it in a more sort of in a outside of a political context.
And I would say it's a terrific question. I agree with Will. I think there's been a learning process within democracies, North America, European Union context, about what it means to be a state firm operating from one of these large autocracies, first and foremost China, that it's not the case that the leadership of those firms can ignore what their top political officials and governmental officials want from them. On the contrary, certainly at the strategic heights of industry, those firms are going to be quite compliant on things that are more policy related rather than commercially related. And I think there too, this notion of mutual economic gain between partners may not be seen quite the same from a nominally independent firm that is nevertheless functionally obliged to comply with the top officials in Beijing or Moscow or Caracas or Tehran. I think that's a really important distinction that's slowly been taken on board in many of our open societies.
Well, so let me pull on that thread and with one of the questions that we came in to sort of close it out. But the question was if you could both sort of talk about the state of American universities and how much you think foreign sharp power is actually involved.
So I think there are real challenges here. Glenn Tifford, who wrote our chapter, is arguably the foremost expert on this question. And so I don't feel equipped to go into the sort of detail that someone like Glenn could go into. But I've observed in the recent past persistent challenges across the university sector, across a wide range of open societies. I wouldn't limit it to the US. My impression is that we're making some progress across these independent institutions in open societies, but there is a very significant amount of work to do, in part because of the ambitions of autocracies and their surrogates to use partnerships in the way we've framed it in the book to exploit the partner on the side in the independent institution, often to get hands on important information. Sometimes it's to build relationships that aren't transparent in the university setting. And then one other really important point in this context is that it isn't necessarily the case that the challenges we're discussing here would cross a line of legality, at least not one that's crystal clear. And I think one of the things that universities and other institutions and open societies have been grappling with is, how do you respond to, say, subtle forms of intimidation that might be applied by someone representing the CCP or the Russian Federation in a university setting, which is thoroughly inappropriate, shouldn't be tolerated, but maybe isn't seen as illegal. I think universities in many places, there are examples in Australia, we've seen some in Canada, there have been a number in the US, I've seen some in Germany over the recent period. These are really tricky questions where, in essence, I would contend, as we argue in the book, that open societies need something like a new quality of preparation, understanding that this is happening, it's persistent, it's something that these authoritarian powers are unlikely to put on a back burner or shelve. And hence, it's almost our obligation to take more affirmative steps to make sure that democratic norms of free expression, academic expression are safeguarded, and at a minimum, making sure that charters and standards on university campuses are enforced as they are now, and then to think about whether there might be a bit more action required beyond that.
Yes, I think that's all correct. I think the again, much like within the media example, the universities are vulnerable to these types of partnerships that that really can exploit their own openness and violate the very sort of academic tenets that are sort of part of a university's founding principles. And we can see this through whether it be, in the most basic examples, or sort of just are just gifts and funding, or whether it could be something that involves access for research purposes. I mean, this is not, this is not a new tension, in the sense that you can go back decades and academics have had to walk a line in terms of thinking about what does my work mean for my ability to continue to return to country X or Y for field research. This is a very old question. It's just that now it's a multi-pronged and much more complex and multifaceted one, and it's something that is of top concern, should be of top concern for administrators, and not just that one sole professor who's thinking about their own future research and work. I would just go back to sort of in sort of thinking about in closing. I mean, in large part, what we're describing in all these different veins are different ways in which open societies are vulnerable to sort of the penetrating power of sharp power. And it is, I think the really important contribution here is that if we go back, if we were having this conversation 25 years ago or so, we in sort of democratic world, if you will, were making bets about how the future was going to unfold. And we were in many ways making a bet that there were a number of different forces in the world that basically put the wind at democracy's back. That that if things go as we believe they will, it's tilting towards democracy's favor. And so that meant that the internet was going to expose people to new ideas, and a rising middle class in these different countries would lead to sort of those very same people looking for political rights in keeping with their new economic power. And in universities were a key part of this. The notion being that as these elites in other countries look to send their children to the finest universities, in many instances that was going to be universities in the West, and the exposure that these young people would have to this free thinking academic university setting would lead to them coming back and being surrogates, in essence, to sort of propagate those values back home. And now, if we were to sort of take that moment, that time capsule, and then jump to where we are right now, it hasn't it hasn't, those forces haven't necessarily led to that outcome. And we are seeing that they are, and going back to Chris's original point, their goal of success was not some evolutionary progress towards greater political freedom. If anything, they want to freeze that in time while extracting as much of the benefits of globalization and the international system as they can. And so sharp power is a sort of a frontier of that struggle. And our hope here is that through these chapters, you can see many different ways in which it's at work.
I think the one point I would add to this, Molly, just to build on Will's point, I think the failure of imagination in open societies to imagine that countries that themselves don't permit independent journalism, prevent freedom of expression, subjugate political opposition, repress civil society, that somehow, if they engaged in the world, that they would seek to do things in a softer way. I think that was one of the fundamental flaws in the thinking, and we're still reckoning with that today and trying to play catch up in many ways. But we have to work very hard on that front to make sure we don't fall farther behind.
Well, Will and Chris, I want to thank you both for taking the time and really for putting out what was really a wonderful read and a really important piece here. And so thank you for that and for taking the time to sort of share your thoughts with our AHS folks. And to everybody else, thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to catching you all at the next one. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.